All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. Grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's get those gears turning. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through one of the most profound, fiercely debated philosophical battlegrounds of our time. Today, we're looking at the ultimate clash of worldviews. On one side, we have the impassioned atheism of evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, and on the other, the rigorous Christian theology of Alister McGrath and neuropsychologist Joanna McGrath. We're going to treat this like a masterclass in dialectics. We'll examine the evidence and the arguments exactly as they're laid out by these formidable thinkers. Because, let's be real, how we answer this dictates how we view our entire purpose in the universe.
So, here is our central Socratic question for this session. Are science and faith destined to collide, or can they logically coexist? Now, as we evaluate the evidence today, we're going to maintain a strictly impartial academic approach. We aren't here to declare a winner. No, we're here to understand the fundamental architecture of both arguments. How do these brilliant scholars look at the exact same universe and come to such radically different conclusions? Let's find out.
Here's our course syllabus for today. First, scientism versus religious faith. Second, Dawkins and McGrath compared. Third, the God of the gaps. Fourth, Noma and Poma explained. And finally, top 3 arguments summarized.
Section 1. Scientism versus religious faith. Let's dive right into our first battleground, which concerns the very boundaries of scientific inquiry and what actually constitutes truth.
Let's kick things off by defining a really crucial term, scientism. Now, Dawkins asserts that empirical science, meaning stuff based on sense observation and testing, is literally the only way to ascertain facts and build convincing theories. If you can't test it in a lab, well, it isn't credible. But the McGraths throw a massive red flag on the play here. They argue that Dawkins routinely confuses actual empirical science with scientism. So, what is that? Scientism is the philosophical belief that science can, and eventually will, answer absolutely everything, including deep questions of meaning, morality, and philosophy. The McGraths argue this is a huge overreach. To them, it's a belief system in itself, rather than a proven scientific fact.
Dawkins, however, views the origins of religious faith entirely through an evolutionary lens. He argues that human belief in God is essentially a psychological misfire of otherwise incredibly useful survival traits. Okay, think of a moth for a second. A moth's navigation system is oriented to celestial light, which helps it survive, right? But that exact same biological system can tragically lead it right into a flame. Dawkins suggests religion is a similarly destructive byproduct. We have this hardwired biological tendency to obey our elders and to assign meaning to things, like, assuming a rustling bush means a snarling lion wants to eat us. Dawkins says we misapply this survival trait to the universe, erroneously concluding that a creator is out there and loves us. And how does this idea spread? Well, Dawkins argues these beliefs aren't passed down genetically, but culturally. They spread like wildfire through imitation, functioning as social memes.
Moving on to Section 2, Dawkins and McGrath compared. Let's look at a direct side-by-side analysis to see how these differing views on truth build into their broader worldviews.
Comparing these thinkers side by side, the core divergences are pretty stark. On the origins of life, Dawkins relies heavily on natural selection and the anthropic principle. He argues that out of billions of planets, we simply happen to exist on the rare one capable of supporting life, perhaps even within an infinite multiverse. To him, religion is just an aberration, one that actively incites violence. On the flip side, the McGraths defend a rationally intelligible universe. They argue that natural selection can actually be interpreted theistically just as easily as atheistically. And where Dawkins sees religion as a purely violent force, the McGraths point to its historical capacity to transcend and transform human conflicts. They cite inclusive ministries and a tradition of prophetic self-critique to back this up.
Now, this right here brilliantly illustrates Dawkins' most famous logical pushback against a creator. Imagine a tornado blowing through a scrapyard. It wouldn't accidentally assemble a perfectly functioning Boeing 747, right? And spoiler alert, you definitely wouldn't want to fly on it if it somehow did. The universe is incredibly complex, for sure, but Dawkins argues that if you say God designed this incredibly complex universe, then God himself would have to be hugely complex, what he calls the ultimate Boeing 747. His logic is that you simply cannot explain complexity by invoking an even more complex, totally unexplained creator. Natural selection, which shows how complexity evolves from simplicity over huge stretches of time, is his fully sufficient alternative.
But the McGraths do not pull their punches in response. They immediately counter this entire line of reasoning, stating outright, the God delusion is a work of theater rather than scholarship. Ouch.
They argue that Dawkins relies way too heavily on aggressive polemic and cherry-picked evidence rather than rigorous science. They point out a fascinating contradiction. Dawkins constantly demands empirical evidence for everything, right? Yet he provides absolutely no empirical, scientific evidence to prove his claim that religious belief is a virus of the mind. To the McGraths, Dawkins isn't engaging in fair, scientific dialogue, he is just preaching his own secular worldview.
Which brings us to a really fascinating point of synthesis, famously captured by Albert Einstein. Now, to be fair, Dawkins firmly denies that Einstein was a true theist, arguing that many acclaimed scientists just pass themselves off as faith-friendly to be polite. But the McGraths leverage quotes like this to argue that these two fields, science and religion, desperately need each other to form a complete, coherent picture of reality.
Section 3. The God of the Gaps. Let's examine our next piece of evidence by drilling down into this classic philosophical conflict.
Okay, the God of the gaps. It's basically the idea that people use God to explain whatever science hasn't figured out yet. Dawkins aggressively attacks theorists who point to biological mysteries, like the bacterial flagellum. He calls these irreducibly complex anomalies totally unscientific. Dawkins argues that science has consistently filled these gaps in the past, showing, for instance, how even half a wing offers a real survival advantage, and it will definitively continue to fill them. But here's the twist. The McGraths, alongside theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, entirely reject this God of the gaps approach anyway. They argue that sophisticated Christians don't look for God in the shrinking shadows of scientific ignorance. Actually, it's quite the opposite. The real miracle is that the entire universe is intelligible and explainable. The very fact that the universe follows rational laws that our human minds can actually comprehend is, for them, the giant flashing sign pointing to an intelligent creator.
Section 4. Noma and Poma explained. We really need to explore how secular and religious scientists categorize these distinct fields of study to prevent them from constantly crashing into each other.
First, let's establish the academic definition of magisteria. It simply means domains of teaching authority or different realms of inquiry. Getting a handle on this term is absolutely key to seeing how top scientists view the overlap or the total lack thereof between the empirical world of science and the spiritual realm of meaning.
So the legendary evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould famously pitched this idea of NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. He believed science and religion are totally separate, walled-off domains that just shouldn't interfere with one another. Astrophysicist Martin Rees and biologist Peter Medawar tend to agree, noting that science simply cannot answer the massive existential questions like, how did everything begin, or what is the point of living? But shifting gears from that strict separation, the McGraths advocate for POMA, partially overlapping magisteria. They firmly believe that while science and religion definitely have distinct focuses, they can, and absolutely should, mutually inform one another to give us a much richer, unified understanding of the truth.
Section 5. Top 3 arguments summarized. To conclude our seminar today, let's bring it all home by clearly outlining the strongest, heaviest-hitting evidence from each side. Let's recap Richard Dawkins' top 3 pillars. First, natural selection is a fully sufficient alternative to the God hypothesis. It perfectly explains how mind-boggling complexity arises from pure simplicity over vast amounts of time. Second, religious belief is not divinely inspired, it's just a psychological misfire propagated as a cultural meme. And third, religion is absolutely not necessary for morality. In fact, Dawkins argues it actively robs people of true inspiration and directly causes segregation and horrific violence. He firmly believes a secular, science-driven worldview offers far better explanation, exhortation, consolation, and inspiration.
Now, let's summarize the McGraths' top 3 counterpunches. First, the overarching intelligibility of the universe is the true evidence for an intelligent creator, not those shrinking scientific gaps. Second, Dawkins totally dismisses the fact that roughly 40% of scientists actively maintain a belief in a personal God. He writes them off unfairly. They also point out that highly intelligent adults, like the philosopher Anthony Flew, have converted to belief much later in life. And third, the McGraths argue that the complete absence of religion has historically led to just as much horrific violence. When societies turn secular ideas into unquestionable idols, you get absolute tragedies like the French Revolution or the genocide perpetrated by Pol Pot in Cambodia. They argue Dawkins uses highly selective evidence to unfairly paint religion as the sole axis of evil.
Wow, we have covered immense philosophical ground today. We've examined the absolute edges of where empirical science meets human faith. We've looked at Dawkins' brilliant defense of natural selection and his fierce critique of faith, and we've weighed that directly against the McGraths' robust arguments for an intelligible universe and the dangerous limits of scientism. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought.
Having reviewed the structured evidence from both of these truly formidable perspectives, which philosophical framework holds the most weight for you? Keep questioning, keep evaluating the evidence, and I will see you in the next explainer.